June from Berkeley asks, who is the greatest team in the last 10 years? Obviously, this is an NBA question, I'm assuming. This might be the weakest 10-year run in a long, long time. We have the Spurs in '05, Miami in '06, Spurs in '07, Celtics in '08, Lakers in '09 and 2010, the Mavs in 2011, Miami in 2012 and 13, and the Spurs last year. There's a couple of repeat champions, the Lakers and Miami, but in my opinion, no real dominant teams. I'm tempted to go with either the Celtics in 2008, despite their real shaky start that season, or the Lakers in 2009 when they had Kobe, Gasol, Bynum, Fisher, Ariza, Lamar Odom, and Phil Jackson, obviously the coach. I'd go with that team over the 2010 one for a couple of reasons. Primarily, I rate Ariza a lot more than I do Meta World Peace at that time. Ariza was so underrated. His on-ball defense, his three-point shooting was superior. I mean, people will probably think that I'm on drugs for saying that Ariza was a better defender than World Peace. Look, Artest / World Peace, obviously the name change is a bit confusing, especially to new NBA fans. When Artest was in Indiana, he was a really good defender. When he was in LA, he wasn't so much the perimeter defender that he once was. He was more of a post defender, physical defender, big body, obviously, and he could like direct players around with his strength. But Ariza got into passing lanes. He came up some huge steals in that Denver series. Great shooting, and you didn't have the bonehead plays. Meta World Peace had those bonehead moments, and he absolutely bailed them out too. I mean, obviously that great example is the Game 5 against Phoenix, where he took that horrific three-point shot when they were up by 3, and they just got the offensive rebound. I think it was 14 seconds or something. They should have just held it. He takes a three-point shot, he bricks it. Jason Richardson comes back and banks in a 3. Kobe has to put up a last-second shot, which airballs, and who is there? Meta World Peace, who gets puts it back in, and just in the nick of time, and rolls around and goes in, and all of a sudden he's a hero again. And just that series is a perfect example of how he played. Not a whole lot of thought goes into his game, which is so weird because on the defensive end there's so much that he actually puts in, so much work that he puts in, so much thought, so much structure, so much intelligence. But then on the offensive end, the total enigma. I think Ariza was much more consistent on the offensive end, as well as being very productive on the defensive end. So I would go with that 2009 Lakers team if I'm going to pick one. But if I'm going to pick a team, I don't know who the greatest is because it's such parity. I'm trying to balance it out here. I can't go with what's preventing me from going it'd be much easier to say, well, it's got to be either the Heat or the Lakers because they were back-to-back champions. I'm looking at how they were eliminated more than anything. The Lakers, when they were going for that three-peat and they ran into Dallas absolutely destroyed them. It was hard to watch. The first 2 games in LA, the Lakers had big leads in the fourth quarter. I think double-digit leads in both games. And Dallas came back and took them both. It was a perfect example of how in control they were of that series. And then they just absolutely blew them out in games 3 and 4. Game 4 was maybe the toughest one to watch. Because I was expecting a competition in that series. It's so, with the exception of Detroit and Chicago, I can't think of another time when a back-to-back champion going for a three-peat has been swept. And of course Chicago swept them. But that Chicago team would go on to win 6 titles out of 8 years. Well, not that team, because obviously the second three-peat was different to the first. But that Chicago team that beat Detroit won 3 straight titles. Oh, sorry, the Lakers, of course. The Lakers, when they were on the verge of winning their own three-peat, they lost to Detroit. But Detroit, you see where I'm going with this. Detroit would go on to win back-to-back titles. And then you saw Chicago would go on to win 3 straight titles. Dallas won 1 title, and they were never really competitive. They were out the first round the next year. They haven't been out of the first round since. So that was such a emphatic beatdown that it kind of puts a stain next to that team. Miami, same thing, that we just saw this last year. I mean, they were just so... It wasn't even close. I mean, the first 2 games were close, but those last 3 games, it's like, well, this team isn't really a dominant team. It's like when they're actually challenged, when they're actually pushed, they've completely faltered. And that's why I'd probably go with Boston. Boston in 08. I mentioned it before, they struggled really heavily against Atlanta in the very first round, and against Cleveland. Now, the Cleveland one is a little bit more acceptable because they were going up against the reigning Eastern Conference champions in Cleveland. Atlanta was just... that was more of Ray Allen just completely losing himself. I've never seen a more dramatic shooting slump in my entire life, where a player historically, like his entire career, has been a great shooter and then just disappears. And in a series that it shouldn't have even been close. And Atlanta really pushed them. The next series against Cleveland, obviously Cleveland played brilliant. They had just come off an unexpected finals run. LeBron was amazing. That period might have been the absolute peak of LeBron's skills, or his prime. When we look back at it, it didn't result in any championships, but that run where he took them to the finals and then took Boston to 7 games and put up 45 points in that Game 7 in Boston, that was very impressive. And it was so disappointing to see his fall from grace in big games in 2010 and 2011 after that, because we were starting to expect him to really dominate. And he was showing signs that even in losing efforts, he was by far and away the best player on the court. So Boston got through that on the back of Paul Pierce's 41, one of the great duels of all time. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Paul Pierce versus LeBron, Game 7. And then up against Detroit, who have been to the conference finals so many years in a row. They finally kicked into gear. It's rare that... it's funny because conference finals, NBA finals, is usually where teams slow down. That's where they picked up. And that Game 5 was one for the ages. And that's one that Ray Allen finally broke out of his shooting slump. And then they got through Detroit in 6 games. And then they ran into the Lakers, won the first 2 games. Lakers blew them out in Game 3, up by 20-something points in Game 4. And the Celtics came roaring back and ended up stealing Game 4 in one of the most dramatic NBA Finals games in recent history. Game 5, the Lakers would win. It was very close. I remember Kobe steal and dunk at the end of the game to really seal that. But then you had that resounding victory in Game 6 by 30-something points in Boston, which sealed the deal. I would go for that. I would think that Celtics team was the best out of all of them. But an underrated one is the Spurs team that we just saw win the title. Not one player averaged over 30 minutes a game. And that's you talk about breaking of the molds. For so long, we've got this idea of to win in basketball, you have to have the best player. Or a dominant player at the very least. It's kind of like what Jordan went through. People would say, well, you need a dominant center. Well, then all of a sudden that changed to, well, you need a dominant player. And maybe after what we've seen from the Spurs last year, maybe we can start changing the way we think. Maybe, well, we don't need a dominant player at all. You need players that are ready, willing, and able, and have the confidence to go out there and just play well, and play smart, and play hard. I would go with Boston barely, just because I'm not really confident with that. So if I'm lining up both these teams, I'm lining up Boston from 08 up against the Spurs from this past year. I would very, very